My wife was always full of surprises, but nothing could have prepared me for her recent discovery. One day, she came up to me all excited, talking about some intimate chair she read about. Apparently, King Edward VII himself came up with the design. She showed me a picture, and honestly, it looked like something straight out of a bizarre antique catalogue. But I'm not the type to dismiss her interests without a second thought, so when she asked if we could build it, I agreed. Why not? We weren't short on materials, and it looked like a decent enough project to kill some time on a weekend. We spent the next few weekends putting that thing together. It was a strange piece of furniture, to say the least. The design was intricate, and at times it felt ridiculous to be building something like that. But the smile on her face kept me going, so I didn't complain. When we finally finished, she seemed thrilled, almost like a kid with a new toy. We put the chair in the storage room, away from any visitors. I didn't want to explain to anyone what this peculiar piece of furniture was doing in our house. To be honest, after a couple of weeks, the novelty wore off, and the chair just sat there, collecting dust. Time went by, and we both seemed to forget about the chair. Life went on as usual, but I noticed my wife seemed restless. She'd been talking about feeling like we were in a bit of a rut, same routines, same conversations, nothing new or exciting. I couldn't argue with that. She suggested we organize a getaway with our friends, maybe head out to the woods for some fresh air and relaxation. She wanted more time with people we both knew, something different to break the monotony. I figured it was a good idea. We hadn't gone out with our friends in a while, and a camping trip could be just the thing to shake things up. The idea of getting out of the house and doing something different sounded good to me. I wasn't one to complain about routine, but even I had to admit things had gotten a bit too predictable. A camping trip with friends could be a good way to break that cycle. The thought of sitting around a campfire, grilling some meat, and just relaxing under the stars seemed like a nice change of pace. Plus, I knew my wife enjoyed spending time with our friends, and if it would make her happy, I was all for it. We talked it over for a bit, and she seemed genuinely excited about the idea. She started listing off the friends we could invite, and I could see the enthusiasm in her eyes. It had been a while since we had done anything like this, and I could tell she was already imagining the trip in her mind. I nodded along as she spoke, and the more we discussed it, the more I liked the idea myself. It felt like something we both needed, a break from the usual, a chance to unwind and just enjoy ourselves. I told her I'd handle the planning. I'm the kind of guy who likes to make sure things are done right, and if we were going to do this, I wanted it to go smoothly. I started thinking about what we'd need: tents, food, drinks, all the essentials. It wasn't going to be anything fancy, just a simple trip with good company. I figured I'd reach out to our friends and see who was interested. It wouldn't be too hard to get a group together, most of our friends were always up for something like this. My wife seemed relieved that I was on board with the idea. She gave me a smile, and I could tell this was something she really wanted. It wasn't just about the trip, it was about breaking the routine, doing something different together. I wasn't the type to get overly sentimental about these things, but I understood where she was coming from. Life had gotten a bit too predictable, and a change of scenery could do us both some good. We decided to set a date for the trip, giving us enough time to get everything ready. My wife started reaching out to a few of her friends, and I did the same. It felt good to have something to look forward to, something that wasn't just another day at work or another weekend spent at home. The more we planned, the more I started to feel like this was exactly what we needed. A break from everything, just us, our friends, and the open woods. With the plan starting to come together, I could see a change in my wife's mood. She seemed happier, more energized. I wasn't one to make a big deal out of these things, but it was good to see her like that. And honestly, I was starting to look forward to it myself. It had been too long since we'd done anything like this, and I had a feeling it was going to be just what we needed. The trip was coming together, and I took it upon myself to handle the logistics. I reached out to everyone, made sure we had all the gear, and set a date that worked for the group. We packed up the essentials, tents, food, drinks, and everything else we needed for a weekend out in the woods. I like things to go smoothly, so I made sure every detail was accounted for. The excitement was building, and soon enough, the day came for us to head out. We all met up at the designated spot and caravaned to the campsite. It was a good group of friends, people we'd known for years. When we got there, I noticed someone I didn't recognize. He was a young guy, probably in his mid-20s, and had that cocky look about him that immediately made me wary. I found out he was a friend of one of our buddies, and apparently, he'd just tagged along for the trip. I didn't think much of it at first, figured he was just another friend of a friend. But as the day went on, I started to notice things that didn't sit right with me. The guy was loud, always trying to be the center of attention. He kept making these crude jokes, the kind that weren't just in bad taste, they were downright disrespectful. He'd latch onto whatever woman happened to be nearby, cracking jokes that were more offensive than funny. I watched as he moved from one to the next, like he didn't care who he offended. It wasn't long before I found myself keeping an eye on him, making sure he wasn't bothering my wife or anyone else too much. It wasn't the kind of behavior I wanted to deal with on what was supposed to be a relaxing trip. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A couple of the other guys gave him looks, but no one said anything. Maybe they didn't want to cause a scene, or maybe they just figured it wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, the guy kept pushing boundaries, and it was starting to get on my nerves. I could see my wife rolling her eyes at his comments, but she didn't seem too bothered. Still, it was enough to put a damper on things for me. I wanted to relax, not babysit some idiot who didn't know when to shut up. By the time the trip was over, I had mixed feelings about the whole thing. On one hand, it was good to be out in nature, away from the usual routine. On the other hand, this guy's behavior had been a constant annoyance. I couldn't understand why no one else seemed to care. My friends just brushed it off, like it was no big deal. Even my wife seemed to think I was overreacting. When I brought it up on the drive home, she just shrugged and said, "People are different. He's just that type." That wasn't the response I wanted. I wasn't trying to be overly critical, but there was a line, and this guy had crossed it more than once. I told her that I didn't appreciate the way he acted, especially around the women in the group. She just sighed and told me to let it go. "It's not worth getting worked up over," she said. Maybe she was right, but it still didn't sit well with me. I didn't like the idea of someone like that being around my friends, especially my wife. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I'm not usually one to dwell on things, but this guy had gotten under my skin. It wasn't just his jokes, it was the way he carried himself, like he could do or say whatever he wanted without any consequences. It made me wonder why no one else seemed to see it. I brought it up with a couple of the guys later, but they just laughed it off. "He's young," they said. "He'll grow out of it." Maybe they were right, but I wasn't so sure. I tried to let it go, but it lingered in the back of my mind. I didn't want to be the guy who overreacted or made a big deal out of nothing, but I also didn't like the idea of ignoring something that felt wrong. My wife and I didn't talk about it again. She seemed to think it was all just harmless fun, and maybe it was, but I couldn't help but feel like there was more to it. The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. After some time had passed, the group of friends decided to get together again, this time at a bar. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxed evening, just drinks, laughter, and catching up with everyone. We all gathered at one of our favorite spots, and things started off well enough. Everyone seemed to be in a good mood, and it felt like a chance to put the awkwardness of the camping trip behind us. But then, I noticed that same guy from the camping trip. He tagged along again, and my gut immediately told me this wasn't going to end well. At first, he kept to himself, just chatting with a few people and ordering drinks. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd learn to tone it down a bit. But as the night went on, it was clear he hadn't changed. He started making those same kinds of crude jokes, trying to be funny, but it came off as disrespectful. This time, his target was the wife of one of my friends. He kept making comments that were way out of line, and you could see it was starting to make her uncomfortable. I watched as my friend tried to laugh it off at first, but it was obvious he was getting annoyed. Things escalated quickly. My friend's wife was trying to ignore the guy, but he wasn't getting the hint. He just kept pushing, like he didn't care how uncomfortable he was making her. Finally, my friend had enough. He told the guy to back off, and you could hear the tension in his voice. The guy didn't take it well. Instead of apologizing or backing down, he got defensive, throwing back some smart-ass comment. It was like he didn't understand, or didn't care, that he was crossing a line. The two of them started going back and forth, and it was getting heated. Word by word, the situation escalated, and soon they were standing face to face, ready to throw punches. I could see my friend was fed up, and honestly, I didn't blame him. The guy had been asking for it since the camping trip, and now he was pushing the wrong person. A couple of us stepped in, trying to break it up before it turned into a full-blown fight. It took some effort, but we managed to pull them apart, and the guy eventually backed off, grumbling under his breath. The rest of the night was tense. The mood had shifted, and the fun, relaxed atmosphere was gone. My friend and his wife left not long after, and I couldn't blame them. The whole thing left a sour taste in my mouth. I watched as the guy continued to act like he hadn't done anything wrong, laughing with a couple of other people like nothing had happened. It was clear to me now, this guy was trouble, plain and simple. He didn't care about anyone but himself, and he definitely didn't respect boundaries. On the way home, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. It was one thing to be obnoxious at a camping trip, but this was different. He'd gone too far, and it was clear he wasn't going to change. I talked it over with my wife again, and she seemed less dismissive this time. She agreed that the guy had crossed a line, but she still didn't seem as bothered by it as I was. Maybe she just didn't see it the way I did, or maybe she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Either way, I knew I was done giving this guy the benefit of the doubt. To me, it was obvious now, this guy was nothing but trouble. He was a sleazebag, a sleaze who thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. I didn't want him around my friends, and I definitely didn't want him anywhere near my wife. I decided then and there that if we ever ran into him again, I wasn't going to sit back and let him ruin another night. I'd had enough of his behavior, and I wasn't going to let it slide anymore. Not long after the bar incident, I noticed something that caught me off guard. My wife had been spending a lot of time on her phone, more than usual. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone has their moments when they get caught up in messages or social media. But it became hard to ignore. She was constantly typing away, and it wasn't her usual pattern. One evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to ask her who she was talking to. I expected her to mention one of her friends, but when she said it was that same guy from the bar, I felt my blood start to boil. I didn't even realize how fast I reacted. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed her phone. I couldn't believe she was still in contact with that sleazebag. The guy had made a complete fool of himself at the camping trip, then again at the bar, and now here he was, messaging my wife like they were old friends. I demanded to know what they were talking about, but I didn't give her much of a chance to respond before I told her to cut it off. I wasn't going to tolerate any kind of relationship between her and that guy, not after everything that had happened. My wife was shocked by my reaction. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and honestly, maybe I had, for a moment. She snatched her phone back and glared at me, asking what my problem was. I told her exactly what my problem was. That guy was bad news, and I wasn't going to let him worm his way into our lives. I couldn't believe she didn't see it the way I did. To me, it was obvious. He was disrespectful, he didn't know boundaries, and he clearly didn't have any respect for relationships. I wasn't going to let him get any closer to her. She didn't take it well. She accused me of being overly jealous, of overreacting to what she said was just harmless conversation. She told me that the guy just had a strange sense of humor, that I was taking things too seriously. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to explain that it wasn't just about his jokes, it was about the kind of person he was. But she wasn't having it. She said I was blowing things out of proportion, that I was letting my jealousy get the best of me. It didn't matter what I said, she wasn't listening. The argument escalated quickly. I was angry, she was defensive, and neither of us was willing to back down. I told her that I wasn't going to let some sleazebag come between us, and she told me that I was the one causing problems, not him. It was like we were speaking two different languages. I couldn't understand why she was defending him, and she couldn't understand why I was so adamant about cutting him off. The whole thing felt like it was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Eventually, she stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, seething. I hated the fact that we were fighting about this guy. He wasn't worth it, not by a long shot. But I also knew I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't stand the idea of him being in her life, even if it was just through messages. He'd already shown who he was, and I wasn't going to ignore that. I wanted to protect her, to make sure she wasn't getting mixed up with someone who didn't respect her or our relationship. That night, things were tense. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was short and cold. I could tell she was angry with me, and I was still too upset to try to smooth things over. I knew I'd come on strong, but I didn't regret it. I'd do it again if it meant keeping that guy away from her. But it didn't make the silence any easier. I hated the distance that had formed between us, and I hated that it was because of him. After a while, I noticed my wife had started leaving the house more often. She said she'd signed up for some self-development courses, something to help her grow, to keep her mind active. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd always been interested in learning new things, and it seemed like a good way for her to do something different. She seemed excited about it, and I wanted to be supportive. I told her it was a great idea, and I meant it. But as time went on, I started to feel like something was off. It wasn't just the fact that she was going out so often, it was the way she did it. She'd leave the house with a strange sense of urgency, almost like she couldn't wait to get out. And when she came back, she was always a little distant. She'd go straight to her notebook, jotting down notes, and then say she needed some time to study. I wanted to believe that everything was normal, that she was just caught up in whatever she was learning. But something about it didn't sit right with me. It felt different, like there was more going on than she was letting on. I tried not to let my suspicions get the best of me. I knew that after our argument about the guy from the bar, things had been tense between us. Maybe I was just being paranoid, seeing problems where there weren't any. She'd told me about the courses, she'd shown me the notes she was taking, and she seemed genuinely interested in what she was learning. But despite all of that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like there was a part of her life that I wasn't a part of anymore, and that feeling gnawed at me. One evening, I decided to ask her about the courses again. I wanted to know more, what she was learning, how it was going, that kind of thing. She answered my questions, but her responses were short, almost rehearsed. She told me about the subjects they were covering, how she was learning new skills, but it all sounded a little too perfect. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something about the way she spoke that made me uneasy. It was like she was hiding something, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being kept in the dark. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. I tried to push the thoughts away, to tell myself that I was just being irrational. But every time she left the house, that nagging feeling came back. I started paying closer attention to her behavior, the way she'd get ready to leave, the way she'd rush out the door, the way she'd come back and immediately dive into her notes. It all felt too secretive, too guarded. I wanted to trust her, but it was getting harder and harder to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. One day, while she was out, I found her notebook sitting on the kitchen table. I knew I shouldn't invade her privacy, but my curiosity got the best of me. I picked it up and started flipping through the pages. It was filled with notes, just like she'd said, lists of topics, summaries of what she'd learned, even some sketches and diagrams. It all looked legitimate, like she really was taking these courses. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe I really was just overthinking things. Maybe everything was exactly as she'd said, and I was just letting my suspicions get the better of me. One night, my wife came home, clearly drunk. She stumbled through the door, her laughter echoing through the house, and before I could say anything, she started talking about that Intimate chair we had built a while back. I hadn't thought about that thing in ages. It had been sitting in the storage room collecting dust, forgotten. But here she was, suggesting we use it. I was taken aback, not sure if she was serious or just messing around. But she seemed adamant, and I figured it was part of some playful mood she was in. So, I agreed, deciding to go along with it. She led me to the storage room, her steps unsteady, and opened the door to reveal the chair. I couldn't help but chuckle a little at the sight of it. The whole thing seemed ridiculous, but I wasn't one to back down from a little fun. She told me to sit down, and I did, still thinking this was all part of some strange role-playing game. She grabbed some ropes and started tying me to the chair. It felt a little over the top, but I played along, figuring she was just trying to make things interesting. She was giggling the whole time, and I didn't think much of it. Once she had me tied up, she stepped back, looking at me with a strange smile on her face. There was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place, something that made me feel uneasy. Before I could say anything, I heard a noise from behind her. My heart sank as I saw him, that guy, the same sleazebag who had caused all the trouble at the bar and the camping trip. He stepped into the room, his grin as cocky as ever, and I felt a wave of anger and confusion wash over me. What the hell was he doing here? My wife turned to look at him, and then back at me. Her expression had changed, it was cold, detached, nothing like the playful mood she'd been in just moments before. She told me, without a hint of hesitation, that she was leaving me. She said that this guy, this piece of garbage, was richer than me, that he understood her better, that he could give her the life she wanted. She said he didn't try to control her, that he respected her freedom, and that he was everything I wasn't. She looked at me with a kind of disdain that cut deep, like she couldn't believe she'd ever been with someone like me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like a bad dream, like something out of a twisted joke. But the look in her eyes told me she was serious. She said that he was better for her in every way, that he was 1,000 times the man I could ever hope to be. Her words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. I tried to say something, anything, but the shock of it all had left me speechless. I could only sit there, tied to that ridiculous chair, while she tore me apart with her words. She kept going, telling me how tired she was of our life together, how she felt trapped, how she wanted more than what I could offer. She said that he made her feel alive, that he made her feel like she mattered. I could feel the anger boiling inside me, but there was nothing I could do. I was tied up, helpless, forced to listen to her as she laid out every reason why I wasn't good enough. It was like she'd been holding all of this in for years, and now, with him standing there, she was finally letting it all out. She told me that she was done with me, that she was moving on, and that there was nothing I could do to change her mind. She said that he was everything she wanted, successful, understanding, and, most importantly, not me. The way she said it, the coldness in her voice, it was like she didn't even care that she was tearing my world apart. She didn't look at me like I was her husband anymore. She looked at me like I was just some obstacle in her way, something to be discarded. I wanted to shout, to scream at her, to ask her why she was doing this, why she was throwing everything away for this guy. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare at her, my mind a blur of emotions. She looked at me one last time, then turned her attention back to him, as if I was no longer there, as if I was nothing. And there I was, tied to that chair, forced to watch as the life I thought I had crumbled right in front of me. I sat there, still tied to that ridiculous chair, as she turned her back to me. The next thing I knew, she was with him, right in front of me, as if I wasn't even there. She started kissing him, touching him, and before long, they were full on going at it. I couldn't believe it. It was like everything I knew had been flipped upside down. She was doing this right in front of me, without a shred of remorse or hesitation. It felt like she was trying to humiliate me, to rub it in my face, and I could feel the rage building inside me, hotter with every passing second. She laughed at me, taunting me about how I always tried to control her, how I could never let her be free. She said that this was her real self, that I could never understand her the way he did. Her words cut deep, and the sight of them together made me feel like I was going to explode. I pulled at the ropes, desperate to break free, the anger inside me fueling every movement. I could hear them laughing, her voice mingled with his, and it drove me to the edge. I felt the ropes start to loosen. She'd tied them well, but she hadn't counted on just how determined I was. I pulled harder, ignoring the pain in my wrists, until finally, I felt one of the knots give way. My hands were free, and the rage that had been building inside me finally found an outlet. I tore the rest of the ropes off and got to my feet, my eyes locked on them. They didn't even notice at first, they were too wrapped up in each other, too caught up in whatever twisted game they thought they were playing. The moment they realized I was free, everything changed. I lunged at him, my fist connecting with his face before he even had a chance to react. He stumbled back, and I hit him again, all the anger, all the humiliation pouring out of me with every blow. He tried to fight back, but he wasn't ready for it. He wasn't expecting me to break free, and he sure as hell wasn't expecting me to come at him like this. I didn't hold back. I hit him until he was on the ground, barely able to move, his cocky grin replaced with a look of fear. I grabbed the handcuffs we had ordered a long time ago, something we'd once used for fun, back when things were different. I snapped them onto his wrists, securing him to that same chair he'd found so amusing. He was too dazed to fight back, and I made sure those cuffs were tight. He wasn't going anywhere. My wife screamed, her voice shrill and panicked, but I didn't care. I turned to her, and for a moment, she looked like she didn't know who I was. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't either. She tried to rush towards me, maybe to stop me, maybe to help him, I didn't know, and I didn't care. I grabbed her arm, forcing her back, my voice low and cold as I told her to shut up. She was hysterical, shouting at me, but I wasn't having any of it. I told her to get out, to leave the house and never come back. I wasn't going to let her stay here, not after what she'd done. She looked at me like she wanted to argue, like she thought she could still talk her way out of this, but I wasn't giving her the chance. I shoved her towards the door, her protests turning into sobs as she realized I wasn't bluffing. I opened the door and pushed her outside, her cries echoing through the hallway. I told her again to leave, my voice steady, devoid of any emotion. I wasn't angry anymore, I was done. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with it. I slammed the door shut, her voice cut off abruptly, and I stood there for a moment, the silence of the house pressing in around me. I turned back to the room where he was still cuffed to the chair, his head hanging down, barely conscious. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and I could feel the exhaustion settling in. But I wasn't done yet. There was still more to deal with, still more to set right. I wasn't going to let this be the end of it. Not yet. After I threw her out, I stood there for a while, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, and the adrenaline was slowly wearing off. I looked back at the guy, cuffed to the chair, barely able to lift his head. I knew I couldn't leave things like this, I needed to deal with it. I grabbed my phone and started calling a few friends. These were the kind of guys I could trust, the ones who had my back no matter what. I told them what had happened, every ugly detail, and they didn't hesitate. They said they'd be right over. It didn't take long for them to show up. When they walked in, they took one look at the guy in the chair and knew I wasn't exaggerating. He looked pathetic, slumped over, still trying to process what had happened. My friends were furious, not just for me, but for the disrespect this guy had shown. One of them, Alex, shook his head and said we couldn't just leave it like this. He suggested we take him out to the woods, teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. The others nodded in agreement, and honestly, I couldn't argue with them. We got him out of the chair, and he was too out of it to fight back. He tried to mumble something, maybe an apology, maybe some excuse, but none of us were interested in what he had to say. We tied his hands behind his back, making sure the knots were tight, and dragged him out to the car. He stumbled, barely able to keep his balance, but we weren't gentle. He deserved every bit of this, and more. He needed to understand that there were consequences for what he'd done. We drove out to the woods, the car silent except for the occasional groan from the guy in the back seat. I could feel the tension in the car, the anger from my friends, the disbelief that something like this had happened. No one said much, there wasn't much to say. We all knew why we were doing this, and we all knew what needed to be done. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure this guy knew he couldn't just walk all over people without consequences. When we got to a spot not far from the road, we pulled over. It was quiet, dark, the kind of place where no one would come looking. We got him out of the car, and he looked around, his eyes wide with fear. He started to beg, saying he was sorry, that he didn't mean for any of this to happen. But it was too late for that. We weren't interested in his apologies. We dragged him a few feet into the woods, away from the road, and tied him to a tree. He struggled, but he was too weak to put up much of a fight. Alex looked at him, his face hard, and told him exactly why we were doing this. He needed to understand that he couldn't just come into someone's life, disrespect their family, and walk away without consequences. He needed to learn a lesson, and this was the only way we knew how to make sure he got it. The guy kept pleading, but we ignored him. We turned and walked back to the car, leaving him there, tied up, alone in the dark. It wasn't about hurting him, it was about making sure he knew that his actions had consequences. As we drove away, I looked out the window, watching the trees pass by. I knew this wasn't the end of it. There would be more to deal with, more fallout from everything that had happened. But for now, it felt like we'd done what needed to be done. He wasn't going to forget this night, and maybe, just maybe, he'd think twice before trying to ruin someone else's life. My friends didn't say much on the drive back. We all knew this was far from over, but at least for tonight, we'd done what we could. When I got back home, I was hoping for some peace and quiet, but that wasn't what I found. My wife was there, standing in the middle of the living room, her face red with anger. She was shouting, demanding to know what I had done with him. She was furious, calling me every name in the book, saying that I had gone too far. I stood there, listening to her rage, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness inside. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. I didn't bother arguing with her. There was no point. Instead, I walked past her, heading to the bedroom. I grabbed a suitcase and started packing her things. She followed me, still yelling, still demanding answers, but I ignored her. I wasn't going to waste any more time on this. She'd made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it. I packed her clothes, her shoes, everything that was hers, and zipped up the suitcase. She looked at me, stunned, as if she couldn't believe what I was doing. I told her to leave. I told her that she should have thought about the consequences of her actions before she brought that guy into our home. She tried to argue, tried to tell me that I was overreacting, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I grabbed the suitcase and pushed it into her hands, pointing to the door. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with shock, but I didn't waver. I told her again to leave, my voice cold and steady. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. She started crying, her voice breaking as she begged me to talk to her, to listen to her, but I was done. There was nothing left to say. I opened the door and stepped aside, waiting for her to leave. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. She walked out, the suitcase dragging behind her, and I closed the door behind her without another word. The divorce was quick, almost surprisingly so. We both knew there was no going back, and there was no point in dragging it out. She didn't fight me on it, and I didn't offer her anything more than what was fair. It was over, and I wanted it to be done as soon as possible. I expected trouble from the guy, maybe a call to the police, some kind of retaliation, but nothing happened. He didn't call, didn't show up, nothing. I didn't know why, and honestly, I didn't care. Maybe he realized he'd gotten off easy, or maybe he was too scared to do anything. Either way, it was fine by me. A few months went by, and I started hearing rumors. Apparently, the guy had come back and gotten together with my ex-wife. I wasn't surprised. They deserved each other. But it didn't take long before I heard that things weren't going so well. She had found out that he wasn't just a liar, but also broke and unfaithful. It was almost laughable, really. She'd thrown everything away for this guy, and now she was finding out what he was really like. It was like karma had come back around, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. Then, one day, she reached out to me. She wanted to talk, wanted to see if we could work things out. She said she'd made a mistake, that she realized now what she'd lost. I listened to her for a moment, and then I told her exactly what I thought. I told her that she had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. I wasn't interested in going back, wasn't interested in fixing anything. She had made her bed, and now she could lie in it. I told her to never contact me again, and then I hung up. It had been a while since the divorce, and I had started to settle back into some semblance of normalcy. I had moved on from the chaos of everything that had happened, or at least I was trying to. Life was quiet again, and I appreciated the peace. But one day, that peace was shattered. I walked out of my house one morning to find my car completely trashed. The windows were smashed, the tires slashed, and the paint scratched up beyond recognition. It was a mess, and I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was, who could have done this? It had been months since everything had gone down, and I couldn't think of anyone who had a reason to do something like this. But then, as I looked at the damage, I started to put the pieces together. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was personal. The way the car was trashed, the sheer rage behind it, it was clear that someone had a score to settle. And I had a pretty good idea of who that someone might be. At first, I considered my ex-wife. It wouldn't have been the first time she'd done something out of spite, and I knew she was still angry about how things had ended. Maybe she'd decided to take it out on my car, to make me pay in some small way for what had happened. The thought crossed my mind more than once, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of anger at the idea. But as I thought about it more, it didn't quite add up. She might have been angry, but this didn't feel like her style. It felt more desperate. And then it hit me. It wasn't her, it was him. That guy, the one who'd caused all the trouble in the first place. The one who'd tried to take everything from me and who I'd left tied up in the woods that night. It made sense. He'd gotten back with my ex-wife, and from what I'd heard, things hadn't exactly been going well. Maybe this was his way of trying to get back at me, to settle some kind of twisted score. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. It had to be him. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, even a bit of unease. I knew that leaving him in the woods had been a risky move, but I'd thought it was over. I'd thought he'd just move on, that he'd realized he'd lost and let it go. But clearly, I'd underestimated him. He wasn't going to let it go, and now he was coming after me. I stood there, looking at the wreckage of my car, and I felt that familiar anger start to rise up again. I wasn't about to let this go unanswered. I called the police, filed a report, and did everything by the book. But I knew, deep down, that they weren't going to be much help. This was personal, and it was up to me to deal with it. I wasn't about to let him think he could get away with this. I started thinking about my next move, about how I could get ahead of him, make sure he knew that I wasn't someone to be messed with. I wasn't going to let him drag me back into the chaos, but I also wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. The next few days were tense. I kept an eye out, watching for anything out of the ordinary, waiting to see if he'd make another move. I didn't know what he was planning, but I knew it wasn't over. He was out there, somewhere, and he was angry. I could feel it, like a shadow hanging over me. But I wasn't afraid. I dealt with him before, and I'd do it again if I had to. He wanted a fight, and I was ready to give him one. A few nights later, everything took a turn for the worse. I was at home, trying to relax after a long day, when I heard a noise from downstairs. At first, I thought it might have been the wind or maybe an animal, but the sound of footsteps quickly erased any doubt. Someone had broken into my house. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized what was happening. It had to be him, that guy, coming back for more. And he hadn't come alone. I could hear multiple footsteps, the muffled voices of his friends as they moved through my house. I knew I didn't have much time. I quietly made my way to the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I always kept a gun in the nightstand, just in case. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd need to use, but I wasn't about to let them get the better of me in my own home. I opened the drawer, my hand steady despite the chaos going on downstairs, and pulled out the gun. I could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder as they made their way up the stairs. They thought they had me cornered, that I was helpless. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The door burst open, and there he was, the guy who had tried to ruin my life. He had 2 friends with him, both of them looking just as cocky and sure of themselves as he did. They were laughing, like this was some kind of game to them. But their laughter stopped the moment they saw the gun in my hand. I didn't give them a chance to react. I aimed at one of his friends and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the house, and the guy went down, clutching his leg as he screamed in pain. The other 2 froze, their faces going pale. They hadn't expected this. They thought they could just walk in, intimidate me, maybe rough me up a bit. But they were wrong. I wasn't going to be their victim. The guy who had started all of this looked at me, his eyes wide with shock, and then he turned and ran. His other friend followed, both of them stumbling over each other in their rush to get out of the house. I stood there, breathing heavily, the gun still in my hand, as I watched them disappear down the stairs. I could hear the guy I'd shot moaning in pain, his voice echoing through the hallway. I knew I had to call the police. This wasn't something I could handle on my own, not anymore. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, my voice steady as I told the operator what had happened. Within minutes, I could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. I put the gun down on the nightstand, my hands finally starting to shake as the adrenaline began to wear off. The police arrived first, their voices shouting as they entered the house, weapons drawn. I raised my hands, letting them know I wasn't a threat. They quickly moved past me, heading towards the guy who was still lying on the floor, his face twisted in pain. The paramedics weren't far behind, rushing in to tend to him. It was chaos, lights flashing, people shouting, the sound of the guy groaning as they lifted him onto a stretcher. I stood there, watching it all, feeling a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching it happen to someone else. One of the officers pulled me aside, asking me questions, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them everything, how they had broken in, how I had been forced to defend myself. The officer nodded, taking notes, his face expressionless. I could tell he was trying to remain impartial, but there was something in his eyes that told me he understood. He knew I hadn't had a choice. They had come into my home, and I had done what I had to do to protect myself. As they took the guy away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, that it was over, at least for now. Anger, that it had come to this, that they had pushed me to the point where I had to use a gun to defend myself. And a lingering sense of unease, knowing that this wasn't the end. There would be investigations, questions, maybe even charges. But in that moment, all I cared about was that I was still standing, that they hadn't won. I had defended my home, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. After some time had passed, the whole situation began to unravel. One of the guys who had broken into my house eventually cracked. Maybe it was the pressure from the police, or maybe he realized there was no way out, but he ended up confessing everything. He told them about the break-in, about how it had all been planned, and about the other guys involved. Once he started talking, it wasn't long before they caught the rest of them. The entire group was rounded up, and finally, it felt like there was some closure. The lover and his friends were all facing charges. The evidence against them was strong, and with one of their own testifying, there was no way they could wriggle out of it. The court process was long, and there were moments when I wondered if justice would really be served. But in the end, they were all found guilty. The lover, along with his friends, was sentenced to time in prison. The judge didn't show them any leniency, and honestly, I felt a sense of relief when I heard the verdict. They had tried to take everything from me, and now they were paying the price. Interestingly enough, the story about what happened in the woods never made it into the courtroom. I don't know if it was because no one wanted to deal with the complications of that night, or if it was because they couldn't find any solid proof. Either way, it was never brought up, and I was grateful for that. The whole incident was a dark chapter that I wanted to leave behind. It was enough for me to know that they were getting what they deserved without dragging every detail of our past into the public eye. With the trial behind me, I could finally start to move on. I bought myself a new car, a symbol of starting fresh. The old one had too many bad memories tied to it, and I wanted to leave all of that behind. The new car was nothing fancy, but it was mine, and it felt good to have something that represented a new beginning. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I could finally start looking forward instead of constantly looking back. I also decided to move out of the house. There were too many memories there, too many things that reminded me of everything that had happened. It was time for a change, time to start somewhere new. I found a smaller place, something more manageable, and it felt right. It wasn't just about leaving behind the bad memories, it was about building something new, something that was mine alone. The new house was quiet, peaceful, and it felt like a place where I could finally breathe again. Life slowly started to return to normal, or at least a new version of normal. I had my routine, my work, and my friends. The drama of the past few months was behind me, and I was determined to keep it that way. I'd learned a lot through all of this, about trust, about betrayal, and about resilience. It hadn't been easy, but I'd come out on the other side stronger, more sure of myself, and more aware of what I wanted in life. There were still moments when I thought about everything that had happened, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. I was learning to let go, to leave the anger and the pain behind. I had my life back, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me again. The house, the car, the quiet, it was all mine, and it was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, and I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it.